Putting news first. This is BBC World. Now, Hard Talk.
Anti-poverty groups can often see globalisation as part of the problem and not the solution. As efforts are revived to clinch a deal for free and fairer trade, we ask if globalisation could actually make people better off. My guest today is one of India's leading anti-poverty campaigners. Babu Matthew, welcome to Hard Talk. By and large, would you say that economic globalisation is a good or bad thing for the poor in India?
I think it's difficult to make a sweeping generalization. Globalization of the variety that we are now witnessing is certainly doing a lot of damage to the poor.
What do you mean by that?
If I straight away go to the Indian context, then I must say that during the past few years, destitution in India has tremendously increased. Destitution especially among the excluded groups. By excluded groups, I mean the untouchables who are called as the Dalits, the tribals or the indigenous people, the Muslims, the most backward communities, the informal sector.
And you blame globalization for that?
Yes, globalization is unfortunately
But they've always been
aggravating.
discriminated against, if you look at the history of India, sad
Yes,
to say.
social discrimination they have always had. I'm not attributing that to globalization. But I'm talking of their livelihood. Increasingly, they are being deprived of their livelihood.
But isn't that just simply a direct result of the fact that socially and culturally for centuries they have been marginalised in India because of the very rigid caste structure?
Sure, caste system has aggravated their condition. But let's say most of the Dalits are also agricultural laborers. In the past, they used to have enough working days. But now the number of days on which they get employment is getting reduced. The minimum wages are in jeopardy. And they are forced to leave their villages and migrate to urban centers in search of new jobs.
And in what way has globalization caused that?
That's because globalization, for example, has opened up the doors for all kinds of exploitation. The natural resources of India, the mineral wealth of India is being plundered in an unprecedented manner. And as a result of it, take the indigenous people. They are completely excluded and they are displaced from their original habitations.
But when you see the terrific rates of growth that India has enjoyed and how so many cities and places in India are booming, that's a direct result of globalization.
That's true. And it's true. And I think for that reason, we must differentiate between India and Bharat. Bharat is the Sanskrit name for India. And Bharat lives in the villages. So on the one hand, you have prosperity for the elite. And on the other hand, you have increasing deprivation for those who are in the villages and those who are on the fringes of society.
But you're talking about inequality here, which isn't the same as poverty.
Yes, inequality is certainly getting aggravated. And when poverty gets aggravated, inequality is also aggravated.
But when you hear what one of the world's leading globalization experts, somebody who's advised the United Nations on this, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, when he says we need to abandon the conviction that globalization lacks a human face, this amounts to a false alarm. When you look at the evidence analytically, you see that globalization has by and large been very good for India.
I'm not convinced that globalization really has a human face. I find that increasingly those who are displaced are treated with cruelty. In fact, a few weeks ago in the state of Orissa, the police fired and killed 14 tribals. And that's not the human face.
But you're just talking about the downsides to globalization, and most people would agree with you that there are downsides to globalization, but it doesn't mean that you have to say, therefore, globalization is bad. To use an analogy, it's a bit like cutting off your water supply to handle an occasional dripping tap.
Yes, I agree that there can be positive forms of globalization, but what we are now witnessing is not that. We are witnessing a particular form, and I think that's the form which is called the Washington Consensus Model. So as a result, we are experiencing a particular type of globalization. I'm sure the new world would require a form of international relations which should be just. But we are not witnessing that just now.
But let's just go through the steps then. When you see that the Asian Development Bank has looked at the figures and it says that you see that economic growth in India has happened as a direct result of the Indian government since the 1980s, more in the 1990s, opening up its economy to the world. You see that in 1978, poverty levels in India were 51% of the population. By 2000, they dropped to 26%. You cannot deny that, therefore, poverty is linked to economic growth.
I'm glad that you have picked up on the poverty figures. It's interesting to note that while the government of India is talking about 26% below the poverty line, if we examine that carefully, we find that it's a result of manipulation. Statistically, it appears to be valid, but the concepts that are used for the calculation of poverty have been distorted. What I have in mind is the calorific content of human consumption. That's the basis. In the 1950s, the nutrition experts of India, especially Dr. Aykroyd, who was an extraordinarily renowned nutrition expert, he said that an adult Indian of average height and moderate activity requires 2,750 calories of food. The government of India has reduced that to 2,400, 2,100, and now it's nearly 1,700.
But the calculation is based on $1 a day. I mean, and that's what is recognised internationally, isn't it?
If it were $1 a day, it would not be 26%. It is now actually 25 cents. If the equivalent of the calorific content that they are taking into consideration works out to 25 cents.
So how many people? So 26% is around 250 million people the government says are living in poverty. What's your figure then?
I think it would be nearly half the population of India.
All right, but the fact is it still doesn't detract from the point which the Asian Development Bank is making, which is there has been a reduction in poverty levels as a direct result of economic growth. Okay, and let's just explore this a little bit further. When you look at one of the main engines of economic growth, people say, and by and large, economists all accept this, that trade is a very significant factor. I mean, are you fearful of India opening up its markets to more international trade?
No, we are not fearful, but I think that trade must be fair trade. Our experience has been that in the name of asking India to open up, a number of unfair conditions are imposed. I don't think the World Trade Organization in reality has a concept of fair trade. What they impose upon us is their own notion of it. In fact, they are not even truthful to their own philosophy. According to the philosophy of the World Trade Organization, there ought to have been a level playing ground. Instead, you have subsidies galore given to agriculture in Europe.
You've got those in India, though, haven't you?
Sorry?
You've got food subsidies in India.
Yes, but what they are asking us to do is give up these subsidies.
But look at but I mean, the debate is so much, as you put it, which is, oh, the rich world got all these agricultural subsidies, as though there isn't any protectionism or food subsidies in the poorer countries. Take India. You've got 20% average tariffs on imports. You have this soaring food subsidies. So, I mean, one figure says that it takes 6.5 rupees it costs to transport 1 rupee's worth of food to poor people in India. I mean, that's uncondonable, isn't it?
Well, you see, we are able to take care of our starvation thanks to the public distribution system in India. And that is because the Food Corporation of India has been able to gather the grains from within the country based upon a remunerative price. And what the World Trade Organization says is that there should be no support to the Indian farmers.
But you've got inefficient subsidies, just as countries in the richer world have to.
There is a scope for improving the public distribution system, but there's no reason why that should be abandoned.
So you're arguing for one rule for poorer countries like India and a different one for the richer countries?
I'm saying that if the richer countries insist and continue to pay huge subsidies, they have no moral right to ask India to stop giving subsidies to agriculture.
But what they're asking for is this, that the richer countries are saying, OK, we'll remove our tariffs and our subsidies if you, India, for example, open up your markets to our imports, our industrialised goods, our services, our retail sector. I mean, that sounds like a pretty fair quid pro quo, doesn't it?
Well, that's what they say in theory, but the truth is that they are saying by 2013 we will think in terms of reducing agricultural subsidies in Europe and America.
But as a principle, isn't that fair that they should say, we'll do this if you do that, no matter when it's going to happen?
Yes, as a principle, if you have a total package which is based upon the principles of just trade, we would welcome it. But I don't think that's what's happening. It's unjust trade. And they have the dominant position using which their own terms and conditions are sought to be showered upon us.
But in what way is it an unjust trade? I mean, just illustrate for us how it actually manifests itself with the people you work with in India.
Well, you know, a lot of people in India live on subsistence economy. For example, there are various varieties of cereal which are, you know, native kind of food products. Now, if there is importation of food from abroad, these food crops will disappear. And then the ordinary people will not be able to live. As it is, there is increasing starvation and increasing death on account of starvation, let alone malnutrition.
But can't you just accept that, yes, actually, sadly, some people will lose their jobs, but there are other people who get jobs, and so long as the government in India has a safety net, employment, health insurance, retraining for these people, that they can deal with this impact of globalisation. I mean, that's what happens in the rich world.
It's true that there has been some employment created in certain sectors of the Indian economy, but there's been a huge loss of employment in other sectors. And on balance, we find that there is greater loss than gain. And it is this aspect which the government should be able to take care of. You see, those countries which have rejected such conditionalities, such as the conditionalities of the International Monetary Fund, they are doing well. Argentina is an example. East Asia is an example. So I think, you know, there is the crisis-driven model and the strategy-driven model to structural change. And India has fallen into the crisis-driven one.
But you're still saying, despite all this, that you are against globalisation. And the point I'm putting to you is perhaps it's not globalisation per se that's to blame, and that if you mitigate the downside of globalisation by having the retraining programmes and all the rest of it, that actually globalisation is a good thing for India.
Yes, as I said earlier, globalisation of this variety is what we are opposed to. And I repeat, this is the Washington Consensus model of globalisation, where a number of conditionalities are attached in advance. When a loan is given to us, then conditions are laid down. And it is those conditions that prevent India from acting in a sovereign way. The Finance Ministry of India no longer is able to plan on its own. It listens more to advice from abroad. And we have a competent economists within our own country. We'd like to plan our own future. We don't need to be told from outside as to how to run our economy. It is that freedom and sovereignty which is being eroded.
But, I mean, India would say that it does have its sovereignty. But then I want to just clarify with you. So you're saying that there's nothing wrong with people perhaps moving from the agricultural sector and trying to get jobs in an expanding industry or manufacturing, as we've seen the burgeoning middle class in India is doing?
Yes, we would welcome people moving from agriculture to industry and from industry to the service sector. But in fact, what is happening is there's no additional employment being created in industry. It's not on a sufficiently large scale as to take care of those who are being displaced.
Because you need investment, don't you, for that?
Yes, we welcome investment, but that investment...
Would you welcome investment from abroad, foreign direct investment?
We would welcome investment if that's the type of investment that helps Indian economy to grow. If it's a type of investment that destroys existing employment, and if it's a type of investment that makes us permanently, technologically subordinate, we would question that.
Well, let's just see what kind of investment that you... Because, you know, there is this phobia, as the Finance Minister P. Chidambaram has said in India, there is a phobia about foreign money coming into India, and he says, oh, people ought to be colourblind about money. Money is money wherever it comes from. You think he's right on that?
It's not the colour of money, it's the conditions attached to the money. It's what money brings along with it in terms of the type of economic philosophy behind it, in types of the model that it is importing. Don't forget that India had a very large mixed economy, and a mixed economy in which the public sector and the private sector had a role. We had planning as well as market forces operating. Now we are told, subordinate yourself entirely only to the market forces.
All right, well, look, the government, the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and the Finance Minister are trying to liberalise the Indian economy. For example, in the retail sector, they do want to open it up to the big international players. Is that something that you think is good? Would you like that?
No, I don't think so. because there's a huge segment of the Indian population that is dependent upon the type of commodity production and distribution we have at the moment. There are a large number of petty businessmen, petty commodity production. So it's not only those businessmen, but the type of economy that supports that business. If you have the modern retailers from abroad coming, they'll set up their own economy, which is essentially not labor intensive. So there'd be additional unemployment created.
But, I mean, wouldn't consumers benefit from the lower prices?
A certain section of the consumers will. The elite in India will benefit, and they would welcome it. They'd like more.
But even the producers, I mean, these big retailers are going to need textiles, they're going to need T-shirts, sheets, whatever. India can produce also raw materials, not only for their retail outlets in India, but also for their markets abroad. So it would be a win-win situation for India.
No, but if you look at the type of commodities that are sold in the Indian market, these are not manufactured commodities of the European or American standard. There is a parallel economy in India, which is really an economy that's based in the rural, in the villages. And those products get sold through the existing market mechanism. If you bring in the retail, all of them will be replaced by multinational corporates.
Well, why can't the two coexist? I mean, is that necessarily so? You'd have rural households producing soap for people in rural areas, whereas people living in the cities might want the internationally recognised brands.
As of now, there is a certain coexistence. For example, there are, the various manufactured garments that are already in India, and the middle class is accessing that. We are not talking about that just now. When you talk of opening up the retail market, it's the entire gamut of commodities that are necessary in the Indian economy.
But let me just tell you what the West Bengal Chief Minister Bhattacharya has said, because he's very keen, he's banging the drum, isn't he, for inward investment from abroad. And he says if we can't reform and perform, we will perish. We cannot follow North Korea and stick to dogmas.
Yes, West Bengal is one of those extraordinarily different situations in India.
And what he says is extraordinary for a senior communist leader.
It is. And that's because they are tremendously influenced by the experience of the Chinese. Not only influenced, they've also implemented land reforms. There are only 2 states in India which has implemented land reforms, Kerala and West Bengal. So that has already created a different economy. There's a lot of protection which is already afforded. Don't forget that West Bengal has the highest food grain productivity in India after the Northeast.
But the fact that a senior communist leader can speak like this, do you get a sense then that the debate about globalisation is shifting? Because, I mean, there are people like Pradeep Mehta, who works a great deal on international trade and consumer groups in India, recognised as a leading authority on this. And he says the debate in India about globalisation is very much based on one of myths and misunderstandings, and there's a great deal of scepticism which isn't justified.
Well, that's the view of one set of scholars. There are other scholars in India like Deepak Nair, the former Vice-Chancellor of Delhi University, and he has demonstrated how India would do much better if it were to follow the Southeast Asian model, for example. And that is where we accept globalization in a selective manner. We make sure that there's a strategy behind our development. China has a strategy while it is relating with globalization. And India, which had much more experience than China in the mixed economy, is unfortunately surrendering entirely to the Washington consensus.
You're talking about the Washington consensus, the neoliberal consensus, although people are now talking about the post-Washington consensus, but that's another debate. But then the point is, why is there this scepticism? Just exploring with you why there is, people say, a kind of scepticism about globalisation, its impact amongst many people in India.
I think there are the economists who see only the dimension of the elite, and there are the economists in India who are looking at those who are excluded.
But it's not just economists, it's the press, it's people as well.
Yes, intellectual opinion is reflected in the media, and therefore even within the media there is this difference of opinion, fortunately. And that's the strength of the Indian democracy. So every single economic measure that is taken by the government comes under public scrutiny and intellectual scrutiny of a high order. And that's the reason why there is enough material in order to challenge this model of development.
And how do you see India reconciling these tensions in a sense? We all know about the growing middle class, and yet you talk about this pool of poverty which is much greater than the government is acknowledging.
Yes, I think that's where the whole question of listening to the voice of the poor people becomes important. You know, the Constitution of India is a very unique document, perhaps the only one of its kind in the world. It's a constitution which guarantees basic needs to the people. And through judicial interpretation, these have become fundamental rights. So we have the fundamental right to education, the fundamental right to health, the fundamental right to shelter, the fundamental right to earn your living. So as a result of all this, we have an opportunity to try another kind of an experiment. And that's the reason why there is so much of tension in India.
And what's the experiment? What do you mean? What's the tension about? Is it about between those who want to close India and those who want to open it and integrate it more with the world economy?
No, that's only one dimension. There is the other dimension that even within the existing economy, people should be guaranteed the right to have an education. Our government schools must be made to function. We have 700,000 public schools in India. These schools are not working. They must be made to function. Only then the poor have a chance. Similarly, in relation to health, in relation to housing, in relation to clothing. So the excluded communities have started now articulating their voice. How do you give them full citizenship?
So in order to improve poverty, I mean, looking at the British Department for International Development, it says that states with high levels of literacy and rights for women, like Kerala, have been the states which have been most successful in reducing poverty. Is that the key, then, you think, improving education? And then that's got nothing to do with globalisation, has it?
Well, unfortunately, globalisation, for example, GATS.
But I mean, it hasn't got anything to do with globalisation. The right to education and making sure that that is fulfilled is the responsibility of India at the federal and state level, more importantly.
That's true, but there is an effort to try and interfere even in that. And then if you question budgetary allocations for the service sector, for the education sector, if you try and interfere with that and say, look, the government should not make so much of, there shouldn't be deficit financing.
But the government is saying, look, we want to spend more, as they're saying, on health and education, but, you know, we're going to be accused of being fiscally irresponsible. We've got to get the money from somewhere, and that's where they look to the global economy, to trade, to foreign direct investment. That's where the money's going to have to come from.
Yes, if the government were to allocate money from its budget for these basic needs, we would be the first to welcome it. Unfortunately, it is other institutions from abroad which are giving the money for education, and we consider that dangerous. There'll come a day on which they'll suddenly withdraw, and then the whole experiment will collapse. And there must be a minimum allocation for social sector spending, and that should include the basic needs.
And therefore, when you try and help the poor people in India, your efforts must be directed much more at your own national governments rather than pursuing your international campaigns.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, I don't agree with you that there is no link between the international campaign and the national. Globalization is global, and therefore the fight against globalization, seeking justice, must also be international. Of course, it must be rooted in our soil.
Professor Babu Matthew, thank you very much for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you.